We're still in AD 28 and we're still in event 30. And the reason we are is because really two things happen in event 30. One is that an official from the synagogue comes and pleads with Jesus to come and heal his daughter. And the second is that on the way, a woman with an issue of blood that doctors had not been able to heal is healed by touching the hem of Jesus' garment. If you didn't get that particular part of this event, then you can go back to Friday and find the healing of the woman with the issue of blood. But we're going to pick up and review again the request, and then we're going to pick up the result after the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage. So when we look at this particular event, we look at Mark 5 because it has more detail. However, we're also going to be looking at Matthew 9 and Luke 8 to fill in additional information that is covered there in parallel passages. And it gets a little confusing until you see the whole thing in perspective, because in Matthew, to save narrative, we find in Matthew 9:18 that Jairus' daughter has died, while in Mark it says she's very sick and he's beseeching Jesus to come. And apparently what happened here was that when he first arrived, his daughter was only very, very ill and on the verge of death. But while he was with Jesus and evidently on the way to the house, the daughter dies, and a messenger comes and says, "Don't trouble the teacher anymore because your daughter has died." Now, the narrative on the hemorrhage is in Matthew chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. The narrative of the hemorrhage in Luke 8 is in verses 41 through 48. And it's the hemorrhage in Mark is 25 through 34. But we pick up the story after the woman with the hemorrhage has touched Jesus' hem and has been healed. Then comes in Mark, verse 35, that the daughter has actually died, and don't trouble the teacher anymore. But Jesus looked at the man, this official of the synagogue, and he says, "Do not be afraid anymore, only believe." What incredible, wonderful words for all of us to remember. We know that Jesus cares, and he tells us many times to not be afraid. Just believe in him. Trust him. Well, in verse 37, it goes on in Mark. And it says that Jesus took into the room where the daughter was only Peter, James, and John. Now, in Mark, it doesn't tell us anything other than little girl. However, in Luke, it tells us she was the only daughter and only 12 years old. And so we get a better picture in Luke of this child, its age, and the fact that this is an only daughter. And Jesus goes in with this select crowd of just the mother and father, Peter, James, and John. And when he arrives at the house and to their daughter's room, there's weeping and there's wailing. And as a matter of fact, in Matthew, it tells us there's flute players already have been summoned to play a dirge. And Jesus says the child has not died, but is merely asleep. Now, it's really interesting that all three gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say that the people laughed at Jesus. What a shame. They would not have more faith and that they wouldn't laugh at Jesus. Nevertheless, it says in Mark that they put those other people out. It tells us that Jesus went into the room, took the little girl by the hand, and spoke the words, "Talitha cum." And that means, "Little girl, arise." He called her little girl and said, "Arise" to her. And that's exactly what each of the accounts records. And it says, he asked the people to give her something to eat. And it says they were still astonished. And let's face it, all of us can honestly say that. We know Jesus is capable. We know that he can. We know he doesn't always do that. So sometimes when Jesus gives us a miracle, does something astounding, we're astounded, even though we're supposed to have had the faith and said, well, sure, of course Jesus is going to do that. But of course, Jesus doesn't always do that. And so I think we all have to admit that sometimes when we see Jesus do miracles, we're astounded by them because we knew that he didn't have to, but he did. And then we see the power of Jesus. And he tells the parents and those that are immediately there in the room, don't tell anybody, but it tells us in Matthew that news went out all over the land. I mean, how can you keep something quiet like that? There are multitudes that were gathered there that were mourning the girl's death, and now suddenly she's alive again, and they're not going to keep that a secret. They're going to say, we don't believe, we don't understand this. We know she was dead. We were playing the dirge music. We were wailing and weeping. And then all of a sudden she's sitting up and eating. And so we see Jesus with full ability to do whatever he wants to do. And he just calls us to have faith. It's interesting, this morning in the Polk Associational meeting, our speaker said that he had heard a message recently called Don't Handcuff Jesus. And I think that's a great title for a lot of different messages you could preach on the subject. But one of the things that handcuffs Jesus is when we don't believe. We really handcuff Jesus in a lot of ways with our lack of trust, our lack of faith, and our lack of moving forward when he tells us to. So I hope you think about that. Don't handcuff Jesus. If he tells you to do something, believe that he will do it and that he will use you and that he'll give you whatever you need in order to accomplish the task. And that's my thought for the day. I hope you have a wonderful Monday. God bless you, and I hope that you're enjoying kids being back to school. Teachers, I hope that you've rested up for the summer because it probably is going to be another long, hard, tough year this year. And parents, I know you're glad to have a break and the kids back in school. God bless you and have a great day.